Robert Wagner, a person of interest in the death of actress Natalie Wood.
Robert Wagner has been named a person of interest in the death of his wife, legendary actress Natalie.
At 95 years old, Robert Wagner has lived a life filled with fame, love, and unshakable tragedy. For decades, one question has haunted his name: the mysterious death of Natalie Wood, the woman he once called the love of his life. It's been more than 40 years since that tragic night off California's Catalina Island, yet the whispers never stopped. Rumors, theories, and painful accusations have followed Wagner everywhere, in tabloids, documentaries, and courtrooms of public opinion. But in recent years, as age and reflection have softened his voice, Robert Wagner has chosen to speak about it in a way he never did before. No longer defensive, no longer silent, but open, emotional, and filled with the raw truth of what he says really happened, and how it's haunted him every day since. In his later interviews and memoirs, Wagner didn't deliver shocking confessions or new revelations of guilt. Instead, he offered something far more human: grief, guilt, and the weight of living with unanswered questions. This is the story of Robert Wagner's final reflections on the life and death of Natalie Wood, a love that captured Hollywood's heart and ended in heartbreak. And for the first time, we'll hear Wagner's words, his memories, and his truth, told not as a defense, but as a farewell. Long before tragedy entered the picture, Robert Wagner and Natalie Wood were Hollywood's golden couple, a pairing that seemed to have leapt straight out of a movie script. Their love story began in the glittering 1950s, when both were rising stars in an industry that celebrated youth, beauty, and perfection. Natalie was just 18, already a household name after Rebel Without a Cause. Robert, or RJ as friends called him, was a dashing leading man under contract with 20th Century Fox, known for his charm and elegance. Their first meeting, by all accounts, was nothing short of magical. Wagner later recalled that he couldn't take his eyes off her. Natalie, for her part, had once confessed to her mother that she dreamed of marrying him, even before they met. When their paths finally crossed, it felt like destiny. The two began dating, and soon the studio publicity machines couldn't get enough. They were young, beautiful, and madly in love, the very picture of 1950s Hollywood romance. They married in 1957, and fans adored them. Every photograph of the couple, laughing at premieres, sailing along the coast, dancing at parties, seemed to embody a kind of timeless joy. But behind the glittering facade, there were cracks forming. The pressures of fame, grueling work schedules, and the unrelenting gaze of the media began to take their toll. Both were fiercely ambitious, and both carried insecurities that fame only amplified. In his memoir, Pieces of My Heart, Wagner later admitted that he was too young to understand what real commitment required. "We were in love," he wrote, "but we were also surrounded by a world that didn't want us to grow up." Their marriage collapsed in 1962, and for years the two went their separate ways. Natalie married film producer Richard Gregson, while Robert's career took him across television and film. But despite the distance, they never truly left each other's lives. In interviews, both admitted that the bond between them had never disappeared. It had merely gone quiet. Then, in the early 1970s, fate brought them back together. Natalie, now older and wiser, had weathered the storms of fame. Robert, too, had changed. When they reunited, their love seemed deeper, built on shared history and forgiveness. They remarried in 1972, an event that shocked Hollywood and delighted fans who saw it as a romantic second chance. For a while, it was exactly that. The couple built a family, raising their daughters, and tried to retreat from the glare of the public eye. Friends described their home as warm and filled with laughter. Natalie often called RJ her safe place. To many, it seemed they had found the peace that once eluded them, but in the background, the pressure of celebrity never truly went away. Both were still in demand, Natalie preparing for new film projects, Robert working steadily in television. And like many relationships in the industry, their marriage had its share of tension, insecurity, and the ghosts of past mistakes. Still, when asked about Natalie in later years, Wagner never spoke with anything but affection. "She was the most extraordinary woman I ever knew," he said in one interview. "She had light, and everyone around her felt it." Their story could have remained one of Hollywood's most beautiful love tales, two stars who found their way back to each other after life pulled them apart. But as the 1980s dawned, that narrative was shattered in a single devastating night off the coast of California. A night that would change everything, and one that Robert Wagner would spend the rest of his life trying to understand, explain, and live with. It was the Thanksgiving weekend of November 1981, when Robert Wagner, Natalie Wood, and actor Christopher Walken boarded the yacht Splendor off the coast of California. The plan was simple: a relaxing getaway near Catalina Island, far from Hollywood's chaos. But within 48 hours, it would turn into one of the most haunting and debated tragedies in entertainment history. The Splendor was Natalie, and Robert's pride, a 60-foot yacht that had witnessed countless happy moments. That weekend, however, there was tension in the air. Natalie was filming the sci-fi movie Brainstorm with Walken, and rumors of flirtation between the two had made headlines. Friends later said Wagner was deeply insecure about Walken's presence, though Natalie dismissed it as tabloid nonsense. On the evening of November 28th, the group had dinner and plenty of wine at Doug's Harbor Reef, a local restaurant. The waitstaff recalled laughter, teasing, and multiple bottles of champagne and wine. Yet by the time they returned to the yacht, the atmosphere had shifted. According to the yacht's captain, Dennis Davern, voices were raised. He would later claim he heard Wagner arguing with Natalie, followed by a chilling silence. Wagner has always maintained that the disagreement was minor, a typical marital spat fueled by alcohol and emotion. "There was nothing unusual," he would later say. "We argued and she went to bed. That's all I knew." But sometime between 11 p.m. and midnight, Natalie disappeared. Her body was found the next morning, floating in the water near a small dinghy. She was wearing a nightgown, socks, and a red down jacket. The official cause of death, accidental drowning and hypothermia. She was only 43 years old. The world was stunned. Headlines screamed across newspapers, "Natalie Wood dead at sea." Fans refused to believe it was an accident. How could a woman terrified of dark water, who famously never swam in the ocean, end up drowning alone in the middle of the night? At first, the tragedy was treated as a horrific accident. Wagner was devastated, breaking down repeatedly during questioning. His close friends said he was hollow, unable to speak for days. "My life ended that night," he later said. "There's no way to describe what it's like to lose the person who means everything to you." But whispers began to grow. Davern's account changed over time. In later interviews, he claimed that Wagner and Wood's argument had been explosive and that Wagner delayed calling for help once he realized Natalie was missing. These statements reignited public suspicion, turning grief into controversy. In 2011, 30 years later, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department reopened the case, citing new witness statements. The coroner amended Natalie's death certificate from accidental drowning to drowning and other undetermined factors. Investigators said bruises on Natalie's arms and legs suggested she may have struggled before entering the water. Robert Wagner was officially named a person of interest, though never charged. Detectives emphasized that there was no evidence of foul play, only unanswered questions. Wagner, then in his 80s, refused to grant interviews with police, stating through his attorney that he had told everything he knew decades ago. In his memoir, Pieces of My Heart, Wagner finally addressed that night with painful honesty. "We were all drinking. We had a fight. She went to our room. When I looked for her later, she was gone. It was the worst moment of my life. He maintained his innocence to the end, insisting that he would never have harmed Natalie. Friends supported him, calling the renewed investigations cruel and unnecessary. "He has carried this guilt for 40 years, said actress Jill St. John, his later wife. People forget that he loved her, truly loved her. For millions, the mystery remains unresolved, a shadow cast over one of Hollywood's greatest love stories. The Splendor was eventually sold, but for those who knew the couple, that boat would forever symbolize both their romance and their tragedy. As one friend said years later, Robert and Natalie were like fire and light, drawn to each other, burning bright and gone too soon. In the years following Natalie Wood's death, Robert Wagner's life was split in two, before that tragic night and after it. Once a beloved leading man known for his charm, warmth, and enduring Hollywood appeal, Wagner became the reluctant centerpiece of one of the industry's most chilling mysteries. At first, friends and fans surrounded him with sympathy. He was a grieving widower, a man broken by loss. For a time, Wagner tried to return to normal life, acting, raising his daughters, and honoring Natalie's memory. But as the years went by, the whispers only grew louder. Talk shows, tabloids, and true crime specials began to pick apart every detail of that night aboard the Splendor. By the late 1980s, every new documentary or headline seemed to cast Wagner in a darker light. Rumors hinted at jealousy, anger, and a possible fight gone wrong. Many of these claims came from Dennis Davern, the yacht's captain, who changed his story multiple times over the decades. In one interview, he suggested that Wagner had argued violently with Natalie, a claim Wagner called a cruel and baseless lie. Yet the damage was done. To the public, doubt had already taken root. Wagner rarely responded publicly, choosing silence over confrontation. "I have learned," he once said, "that when people want to believe something, no amount of truth can change their minds." Still, those who knew him best spoke of his deep remorse and sorrow, not from guilt, but from grief. He would often visit Natalie's grave quietly, leaving flowers and spending long stretches of time alone. According to friends, Wagner was haunted not just by the loss, but by the what-ifs. What if he had gone after her sooner? What if he had stayed calm instead of arguing? What if she were still here? In 2018, when the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department publicly named Wagner a person of interest, the media storm reignited. Old wounds were reopened. Wagner, then 88, refused to speak on camera but released a short statement through his representative. "I have fully cooperated with authorities in the past and have nothing more to add. Natalie was and always will be the love of my life." Even Natalie's sister, Lana Wood, voiced conflicting emotions over the years, sometimes calling for more answers, other times expressing compassion for Wagner's pain. "I don't think he murdered her," she once admitted, "but I do think he knows more than he's ever said." Wagner's silence became his shield and his prison. He turned down most interviews, preferring to tell his side in his 2008 memoir, Pieces of My Heart. There, his words were tender, reflective, and heartbreaking. "Losing Natalie was the most shattering event of my life. The pain of it never goes away. You simply learn to carry it." He described their marriage not as perfect, but real, filled with passion, arguments, love, and the chaos of fame. "We were both strong personalities," he wrote. "Sometimes that love burned too bright. But she was my soulmate, and I'll miss her until I take my last breath." Hollywood, too, was conflicted. While some distanced themselves, others defended him fiercely. Actress Jill St. John, whom Wagner later married, once said, "Robert's heart was broken long ago, and people forget he lost everything that night." For Wagner, acting became a refuge. He found success again in television, appearing in shows like heart-to-heart reunions and guest roles that reminded audiences of his charisma. But those who knew him privately said the laughter never fully returned. As decades passed, Wagner stopped fighting the rumors. He accepted that the world might never know or believe the full truth. "You live with it," he said quietly in one of his last interviews. "Every day you wake up and it's still there. You just learn to keep going And through that silence, one thing became clear. Robert Wagner's life would forever be defined not by the films he made or the fame he earned, but by the night he lost the woman he loved most, and the endless questions that followed. As Robert Wagner entered his final years, the sparkle of old Hollywood dimmed around him. The mansions, the red carpets, and the roaring cameras faded into memories of a different time. What remained was a man in his 90s, quiet, reflective, and still haunted by a single night that defined his life more than any role ever could. For decades, Wagner carried the shadow of Natalie Wood's death with him everywhere he went. Yet in his later years, something inside him began to change. The once guarded actor grew softer, more willing to open up about his past, not to defend himself, but to find peace. Friends say he had accepted that he would never escape the whispers, but he could choose to live in truth and gratitude rather than guilt and fear. He spent much of his time at his California home with his wife Jill St. John, his steadfast companion of more than 30 years. The two had built a quiet, loving life together, often retreating from Hollywood's glare to focus on family. Jill gave him stability, one close friend said. She helped him see that life could still have light. Even after so much darkness, Wagner became especially close to his daughters, Katie, Natasha, and Courtney, often describing them as the reason I keep going. Natasha, Natalie Wood's daughter from her first marriage, has always called Wagner her father, a bond that spoke volumes about forgiveness and love. In interviews, Natasha emphasized that her family had made peace long ago. "We've all lived with the pain," she said, "but my dad has carried the heaviest burden. I see the love in his eyes every time he talks about my mom." That love, and the regret intertwined with it, defined Wagner's later reflections. In interviews and in his memoir, he returned to the same theme. Love and loss are inseparable. "You can't have one without the risk of the other," he said. "But even knowing what I know now, I'd choose her again." As Hollywood aged, the old scandals began to fade into the background of nostalgia. New generations discovered Natalie and Robert through the magic of their films, West Side Story, Rebel Without a Cause, Heart to Heart, and saw not controversy but talent, charisma, and timeless beauty. In private moments, Wagner was said to often look at photos of Natalie, smiling, laughing, radiant, and fall silent. Friends recalled that when asked if he ever found peace, he would pause for a long time before replying, "Peace? Maybe not. But acceptance? Yes. You learn to live with ghosts." In his last television appearance, Wagner spoke softly about the lessons of a long life. "We make mistakes. We lose people. We live through things we don't think we can survive. But love, real love, that's what stays. It doesn't die." To those who knew him best, Robert Wagner's final years were not about clearing his name, but about preserving Natalie's legacy. He worked with their daughter Natasha to produce Natalie Wood, What Remains Behind, an HBO documentary that offered an intimate, human portrait of Natalie, not the scandal, but the soul behind it. The film was, in many ways, Wagner's final love letter. Through tears, he said on camera, "She was so beautiful, so alive. There isn't a day that goes by that I don't think of her. I miss her laughter. I miss her light." It was not an explanation. It was not a confession. It was simply the truth of a man who had loved, lost, and carried that loss for nearly half a century. As Robert Wagner grew frail, friends noticed a sense of calm in him, as if he finally made peace with the past. "He talked about Natalie like she was waiting for him," one confidant said. "Not haunting him, waiting for him. And so, when the story of Robert Wagner is told, it isn't just a story about suspicion or tragedy. It's about a man who spent a lifetime trying to live with love and pain side by side, and about a Hollywood couple whose romance, though brief, remains one of the most unforgettable in history. "When I go," Wagner once said quietly, "I hope I see her again. Maybe then we'll finally have the ending we never got."